The camera did a countdown for me. That was funny. This is Vicki Kirsch, known as Miss Vicki, here in Boulder, Colorado, 7:30 p.m. on October 2nd, 2018. And my thoughts for today have to do with boundaries and creating order out of chaos. Now, I can only touch this topic in a general way. There's so many different aspects of it, so we'll just be covering one part tonight. And we will talk about what are boundaries, how they are created, and why it is important. So to begin with, I always like to start with this new verse, and I just realized we should print it on the Facebook page, and we will soon. So it goes, "May my soul bloom in love for all existence," by Rudolf Steiner. Now, to begin with, I don't have a chart to show you, which I love charts because it makes it more visible. But I'm going to describe, first of all, a child in Waldorf education. We have these different avenues, different paradigms to look at and how children and how the human being develops. So we have what's called the fourfold path. And the fourfold path involves having a physical body, and then what's called a life body or etheric body. And so that's like out here. And then beyond that is the astral body. And those little people who seem to be very big have very big astral bodies. And above that is what's called the ego. And the ego is referring to the higher presence, the angel being of each individual. So when an infant or a human being is born, the physical body is born. The other three bodies are what are called supersensible or not visible, and they have not yet been fully realized. So tonight we're only going to talk about just a little bit about the etheric or life body. Now, the physical body is the mineral body. It's mainly minerals. We talked about that in nutrition. And the life body is what brings life to it. So when an infant is born, the organs are there only in kind of seed form. They are not mature. They don't function as an adults do. Every one of them, the heart beats at a different rate, the blood flows at a different rate, the stomach works, everything works differently because it isn't fully formed. So it is the life body that's working into the physical body and helping it to form. And so the child is born with the life body around it and helping those organs to form. But it isn't only the life body of the child. The child's life body is contained within the parent's life body, particularly the mother's life body. But that is not to say that the father's life body is not insignificant. It is significant. And so, but first we'll focus on the mother's life body. So the child is contained in your life body. And as the child gets a little older, you start to sense, and I learned this all really through experience with my own children, and I could intuit what was going on with them. And really it is your life body that helps you to intuit what is happening with your infant. They can't talk, they can't tell you anything, but your life body reads them and tries to understand. Are they hungry? Are they cold? Do they need to be held? You know, what are their needs? So they're contained in that life body. And that life body, you can see their relationship to that. They're very, very contented when they're within the realm of your life body. Your life body only has a certain range. It's different for different people, but let's say it's this big around you. And they're really comfortable when they're in that range. They're especially comfortable when they're real close to you, right? And so as they mature, and first they gain control of their neck, and then they learn to sit, and then they learn to crawl. All of that, they start to venture outside of your life body. And, but they're only comfortable doing that in certain situations, usually at home, where they're more comfortable and where it's familiar. It's familiarity that makes comfort for a young child, and repetition. So when you're looking at boundaries for child, repetition and familiarity are two really important words. And rhythm also helps to establish that, because when it happens the same thing in the morning, the same thing at lunch, the same thing throughout the day, that helps them to get comfortable with the boundaries around them. And so as they gain their independence through movement, then they can move outside your life body, and they get more comfortable doing that in your home. So let's say they'll go around the corner from you into the living room out of the kitchen, or eventually they'll let you go upstairs and be comfortable with you leaving their presence. But they always want to know that they are held within your life body. And your life body is not only an actual presence around you, a substance around you, it involves your consciousness. So as I said to parents, they can always tell when they're held in your consciousness. The minute you pick up a phone, the minute you get on your computer, your consciousness has gone somewhere else and they're not comfortable. Their boundary is uncomfortable. Their life body is shaky. And why is that? So as I said, they have the physical body, the life body, then the astral body, and then the higher ego body. That higher ego body is coming into them through their relationship with you and others in their environment. Their father has a lot to do with how the ego body comes in, because the father's more firmly anchored in the ego and more firmly on physical earth. And it shows up in the deep voice, the heavier walk, the more muscular. And so that helps children to come in to their ego. And that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to bring them in, and they come in most healthily when they're in an environment that feels safe, secure, that they're well loved, that when you look at them, when you hold them, when you touch them, you have the utmost joy and wonder and delight in getting to know them. So one of the first things that helps a child to establish boundary is their skin. Your skin is your boundary. It really tells you where you end and the rest of the world is outside of you. So they need to be touched. They need to be stroked. Children in orphanages in the past, they did research was just very sad that they didn't touch babies and they actually die. They need to be touched. They're touched into being. They're touched even before they're born. They're touched in the womb in a really big way, right? And then they go through the birth canal, and that's another major touching. It's a major saying you're coming into a physical body, but all of you won't arrive at the same time, just your physical body arrives. So touch is a really important thing for establishing boundary, especially to establish it in a healthy and positive way, not an authoritarian way. So touching them whenever they're ruffled, whenever they're upset, whenever they're tired or hungry, touching will generally calm them. There are children who have tactile disturbances, but we're not really going to go into that. Excuse me. So there's touch. And then what else helps them to establish boundary? It is movement. Movement gives you a sense of freedom. It helps you to move out of your mother's life body, but it has to happen in a way that's gradual enough that they can embrace it and not feel insecure and not feel abandoned, basically. So, yeah, if you can do that when they're young in a really mindful way, and be conscious of how they're feeling, how you can help them to feel soothed and comforted. And that isn't to say that they shouldn't have upsets and cry. Everybody needs to cry and let out emotions, but being aware that they can go outside your boundary a certain bit. And then, there's instances where they have to be in daycare or they're with grandparents or whatever, and they begin to get familiar with that and gain a sense of confidence around it, that you always come back to them. So the sense of boundary happens, first of all, through those two senses in a very big way: the touch in the skin and movement. Now, as they start to move out of your life body, it's a good thing to kind of build that capacity as you can. So step back a little bit farther each day, a little bit more as you can. Let them get farther on and help them feel confident to get out of your range. So now we have the child themselves, and I would say that boundaries are established very differently in boys and girls. And when I talk about masculine and feminine, first of all, you have to know that we all have both masculine and feminine. And so these are generalizations, but on the whole, girls develop differently than boys. And it has to do with the way the brain functions, the way the neurology functions. With girls, girls are easier with boundaries when they're young in a certain way, and another way they're a little harder, and I'll bring that up. But the way that they're easier is that when a girl has a perception, her mother's talking to her, father's talking to her, something's happening, all parts of her brain, or most parts of her brain, open at the same time. So the visual, the auditory, the kinesthetic, the smell, all of it opens up. So girls are more perceptive of other human beings. That's what gives a mother capacity to read the signs and symbols of what her infant are saying to her, that she has this neurological capacity. And so when you say to a girl, don't do that, or no, we're not doing that, or, divert their attention and so on, most of the time they respond much more easily, depending on their age. 2 years old is a different matter. We could talk about that a little bit, but they just don't have an issue because they really understood more fully. Now, with a little boy, and I learned this actually from the books on raising boys. There used to be 3 or 4 that I studied, and I'm sure there are some new ones with all kinds of new research, but they're the ones that taught me how a boy's brain functions differently. And essentially, it just opens up one aspect of the brain at a time. And for the most part, boys tend to be more visual than auditory. And and most of us tend to be more verbal and not give visual cues. So when you're telling a boy, don't do that, you're using all this verbal, and it's kind of going in one ear and out the other because they're not processing it fully. So that's a key thing to know with them. And what it means is that you have to give them cues. You have to give them visual cues. So when, for instance, they're throwing rocks, you see me go, mm-mm. I don't say much, just mm-mm. And they can see the visual cue. And you don't focus on, no, don't do that. If you say, no, don't do that, mostly what they hear is, do that. And they continue to do that. So when you're guiding them and trying to change their direction, you have to immediately shift to what you want them to do. Mm-mm. Oh, come over here. We can toss rocks in the basket or whatever. Show them, what they can do, because there's a key to young children, and that is that they're not naughty, really. They don't really understand what they're doing in a certain way. They don't understand the relevance of time and space, when it's appropriate to do what. And so they need guidance in, yes, you can throw things, but you can't throw them inside at the window type thing. But you could throw soft little felt balls into a basket inside, but we'll wait till we go outside to throw hard apples over the fence for the goats, for instance. And so using the visual cues with the boys and moving into action, and really not focusing on the don't do that. If you focus on that, then you open up a part of their brain. I believe it's called the amygdala, but it essentially makes them get stuck there. At 2 years old, if you keep saying, don't do that, I said no, mama said no, stop, stop. It gets stuck, and they will just go on and on. And so the keys to working with that are to sing, change the subject, look elsewhere, move them along. Don't focus on what you don't want them to focus on. You have to move it along. And yeah, so the other thing to know about boys, because they do eventually really anchor in the physical world more deeply. It shows in the fact that they have stronger, more dense muscles, more dense bones, the way they walk, the way they have to push up against something to really know where a boundary is. Often they really need to wrestle or have a lot of physical activity pushing against something, because their skin, their tactile sense needs more input, because their muscles are more dense and their bones are more dense and ligaments, etc., that they need more feedback. So boys generally, and of course there's more feminine that doesn't, but on the whole, boys need to have something to push up against, and and that's why they love how a father will wrestle with them, throw them up and down, run and bang into each other, and that sort of thing. And that doesn't often come that easily to a mother, but I did find ways to do little gymnastics on my back with my boys, where I would put them on my knees and bounce them up and down and then kick them over my head and that sort of thing. And just getting really active with them and letting them run and bang up against things helps them to learn this is the boundary of my skin. They have to have a really good punch to understand this is where I stop and the world begins. And yeah, so along with that, what goes with it is that boys' brains operate differently, and that they need to have more of a sense of cause and effect, not in a very intellectual way, but they do better with rules. They do better if they know who the authority in whatever situation they are in, and who that authority is, what the rules are, and are they being fairly enforced. You see bullying going on, and there's many kind of subtle bully behaviors, but you see bullying going on when the boundaries aren't enforced by a person who has a good sense of themselves and has a good sense of what their boundaries are, what the rules are, and how they will be fairly enforced. And in a classroom and a school, if there isn't a teacher or someone that holds that line of authority, then generally the boys, but it can also be the girl, the alpha girl in the room, that will take the authority, but they don't have the wisdom to manage it well. So they take it out on children in inappropriate and hostile ways and mean ways. So you can tell when the teacher has a good sense of authority. And authority is not an authoritarian, sorry, my ear itched, an authoritarian type authority. It means that you're the author. It means that you're the person who has brought your own higher ego in, and you stand there as a person who has convictions about what you think, what you feel, and what you act upon. So in your home with a boy, you have to have rules. They're not like rules like this, but we don't throw rocks at the glass. We don't, there's certain things that we don't do. And so at a much younger age, sometimes between 2 and 3 with boys, one has to say to them, if you do that again, then we will put the ball away and you won't have it anymore till you can learn to listen to me. And that's all it said. You have to catch them in a coherent stage. If they've gone into fits and so on, they're never going to listen to you. You have to wait till the end of the day to bring that up. But boys generally do well with sports because it's very clear who the authority is. It's the referee and it's the coaches. And it's very clear what the rules are. If the ball gets to the home plate before the runner, he's out, right? And are they fairly enforced? Because if they're not fairly enforced, and this happens in families, if they can see you're playing favorites or interpreting incorrectly, then they will rebel against your authority because it's not fair and they feel shamed by it. So you have to be sure that you're not playing favorites. And so they really have to know what the consequences are. And once that's established, then they can operate smoothly within that. They're much more comfortable. They can be more easily in their skin because they know that you're in charge and you won't allow them to go outside, and you help them to incarnate. It's called incarnation, bringing your higher ego in. And so that's a really good thing to know with boys. Now, there's differences with temperaments. For instance, if you look at the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water, if they're fiery, you have to be more fiery with them to establish boundary. And if they're sanguine, you have to be very light and, move along. But still, you have a sense of what your values are. It's, as I've said before many times, you have to be clear in your family what values you have. Because boundaries, there's all kinds of boundaries. Are you going to let your children into all your stuff? And you just have to determine what your boundaries are. There isn't a right and wrong in your own family life. But when you have a rightful sense of authority and you help them to learn how to be polite to one another, which is basically kindness, it's a way of establishing anti-bullying techniques. Please, may I, and so on. And it's your turn. You can have a turn, and then I'll take a turn. Those are ways to help them not get involved with bullying. Bullying is it's a human quality, the lower human. If you think of animals, they have the pecking order. The chickens, for instance, and even the goats, you can see the goats have their pecking order. There's the alpha male, and that's a natural thing, and it actually happens with children and human beings as well. There's a wonderful book called One Mind at a Time. And no, it's called Best Friends, Worst Enemies. And he really debunks a lot of the mythology about best friends and how it is to be in the context of a group and getting along. But essentially, there has to be a hierarchy amidst human beings, a leader and the followers. And that leader doesn't have to be cast in stone, but in any instance, there's a leader and then the followers. And it's helping the leaders how to learn to be benign leaders, benevolent leaders, who can do it with a lot of love and kindness and compassion. And so, and really, we're meant to be in the midst of, in a family situation. For instance, you're with a mixed age groups. And I had the great fortune of being part of my personal family only had 4 children, but my extended family, my parents were one of 11 and one of 9. So I had many cousins, 60 on one side and 40 on the other. And so I got to see how, big groups of children worked. And when you have mixed age children, the older children assume the leadership role, and they have some level of experience to have that role. When you bring children into this modern context of education, where it's all 6-year-olds together and all 7-year-olds together, I think that really presents a big challenge to them socially, is they need that older and the younger to work together. So, I think it's good to have them with different age children. And often in the Waldorf schools, they'll have the seniors work with the youngers and the 8-year-old work with the kindergarten and so on. And it's very good for the children to work with the younger ones to be with older children and the older children to be with younger children. So the last thing that I will say about establishing boundaries, once you determine what your values are and what you want your child to understand about your values, what's you think is correct and what's not, behavior and actions and so on, is when you say something, you need to mean it and you need to have thought it out. when you say, no, we don't do that, you need to really mean it and enforce it. For some children, it's timeouts. Or my kids recently were asked, how did your mom discipline you? And they said, well, I don't remember discipline. She would put us to work. And whenever they were in trouble, I figured they had excess time and they just needed to pitch in and help with whatever needed to be done. I didn't punish them. I didn't even berate them or say much about it until at the evening, as I've said before, putting them to bed. Then I would bring up the topic in the form of a story of, what they had done, and but I would always put it in an image of, for instance, a little squirrel who had bit someone or whatever, and the consequences of that and how he made amends. With boundaries, it's very important that children learn how to make amends, how to redeem themselves. It helps your soul to do that. And I will close with this little thing. It just occurred to me. There's a Hawaiian practice. It's an ancient Hawaiian practice, and it's called Ho'onoponopono. And basically, it is that whenever you fall out of the feeling of love and joy and harmony with someone, you say to them, I apologize, please forgive me, thank you, and I love you. So when the children in my class, I don't deal with the really young ones, but the older class, when something happens, where they're squabbling or they've taken something or there was an issue that needed to be resolved, after, we've spoken about it or whatever, then I'll have them say to one another, I apologize, please forgive me, I love you, and thank you. And then, as my mom used to say, and kiss and make up. So that's all I have to say about boundaries. I would love to have questions and a little dialogue if anyone has something, because children are all very unique. I'm going to look at my messages and see if anything comes up. And enforcing boundaries with children is very different depending on their age, depending on their temperament, depending on many things. And another little thing I will add about boundaries, I believe to always, when they're really, really young and they're like crawling around and so on, their boundary is huge. They have come out of eternity to be in time and space, which is quite limited. And that they need a lot, their boundary needs to be big. In other words, I made their environment very safe for them so they could explore freely, mostly freely. I didn't let them climb the bookshelves, although we did fasten the bookshelves to the walls. So I allow them to explore very freely because they're using all of their senses to gain information about the world, and that they needed to have a lot of room to move in that. Now, as their boundary moves out, they start to crawl, they walk, and so on, and they get more and more capable. It's like the boundary needs to come in a little more for them so that they start to learn the context in life, where you are, who you're with, what time of day, is it safe to cross the street? Are there a lot of cars? Just, they have to learn context. So then the boundaries start to come in like this. So that a young child's boundary is very, very big. And then as they get older, that boundary comes in and is more clear and contextual. And so I have a question, what age do you start boundaries? Well, they really, really start from the beginning. Like I said, holding them, this is boundary. This is boundary. And the swaddling is creating a boundary. It helps them to feel I'm here, and then to be released and flail around, and then to be swaddled again, to be on their belly, to be on their side, to be on their back. All those things help them to start to learn. Here's boundary. Boundary's a different thing than we think. It isn't just what we say and what we enforce. It's a sense of where they are in their skin. So you have your boundary of your skin, and then you have the boundary of your clothing. Well, first the boundary of the lotions and the potions that you put on your boundary or on your body, like the More Lavender, the Hauschka More Lavender, which I highly recommend to everyone because it has a substance in it called More, which refers to peat bog, peat moss. And peat moss, when put on your skin, puts up this little film on you that helps you feel a sense of I'm protected behind there. And then this time of year, you're putting undershirts on them and underclothing, and that helps them to feel boundaried. And then here we start to put on the winter clothes. So the clothing is a boundary. Then outside the clothing, it's the home. First the bedroom, their little bedroom, their whole home, then it's the yard. Those are all boundaries that they move into over time. So boundaries are a much more comprehensive thing than you think, but one of the ways to really bring order to it, I said in the beginning, are to do repetition, familiarity, rhythm, routine. That's what children thrive on. Why? Because it isn't that easy to neurologically anchor all this. Their memory has to see it over and over and over. They have to do it over and over and over for the neurological pathways to be established. That's why rhythm, that's why repetition. That's what that helps to do neurologically. So, and how do you start? So, what about giving choices? They're independent choices. And I think, from a pretty young age, 1 or 2, even. So they're sitting at their high chair, ready to eat, or at the table, however you do that, that you put carrots here and you put a celery stick, whatever. That's a way of giving a choice. And some little children really want a lot of choice. So you have to kind of go with them, but also they can get lost in choices. I've, over and over known little girls who want to choose what they wear, and they're wearing bathing suits when it's 10 below zero. And so you can't give them that kind of choice. And what you do in that instance is you take the clothing away that's inappropriate for the time of year and only give them appropriate choices, right? And yeah, so there's small ways of allowing them to have choice. And I think it is helpful. It's a practice. It's a way of them learning how to make choices, but in a big way, they're not really able to make big choices. Some children have no idea, no relevance about weather, for instance. Is it raining? Is it snowing? And so on. And it is relevant. They can get frostbite very easily because they don't have a mature sense of warmth. They can't tell when it's cold until they are nearly frostbitten. So let me see what else is here. I think you have to work with choice in a guided way until they have a better sense about them. What about precocious personalities? Yeah, where they test your boundary. Absolutely. But what children are looking to see is how well anchored is your higher ego. And I was a young mother. My daughter, I remember this feeling where it would be like she would back me into a corner. She would just keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And finally I would have to yell and do all this stuff to get her to listen or cooperate. And they want to know where your boundary is. They want to see who you are. They're poking at you. And I was going to bring that up about girls who read people so easily that they fairly easily become manipulative. And I believe that research shows that children start to manipulate it very early at like even 6 weeks old, because they know if they go, then mama does this, or if they go, mama does that. And, basically most of us want what we want. It isn't usually relative to whether it's the best thing for us. It's just we want what we want. And so I do believe that it's important for parents to understand, recognize, and work with manipulation, because I don't believe that it's a healthy personality trait to go into life with other people being manipulative. So the precocious personality is generally precocious. It can be, there's a lot of different reasons. Constitution, there's just so many reasons I couldn't even go into it. But often it's that their thinking is prematurely awakened, let's put it that way. Because the thing we have to recognize with children is they are not little adults in any way, shape, or form. Their organs are not formed as an adult, but they can be hardened and pushed into adult performance. For instance, learning to read young forces your eyes to do what an adult's eyes do. Therefore, you have a lot of children with glasses and poor eyesight because their eyes were forced too early to read. They can do it, but physically they're suffering because they're pushed out of a phase of life which is very life-giving when they're allowed to live imaginatively and in a lot of movement and joy in nature. That helps to build a healthy body. And when they're pushed out of that into more of an adult acting when they're young, it creates unhealth in their body, basically. This is part of the whole philosophy of Waldorf education. And if people have more questions about that and would like to discuss that, I could go into that in greater detail. So let's see. Yeah, how do you deal with charming, testing your boundaries? A lot of humor. You definitely have to have a ton of humor with kids, especially when it comes to discipline. And yeah, as the children in my class know, I have the silly bug who comes out and, you know, and for them to know that a mistake is a mistake, it's not a big deal. It really isn't. We don't need to get into situations of shaming them about their behaviors or anything. And I'll talk to them about how I was a child and I did that. And, you know, everyone makes that mistake and blah, 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 all that so that they know that we're all learning. That's all it is. It's a learning process. And how do you set up physical boundaries in the home and also what they can touch with other people's property? That's a good question. Well, like I said, when they're really, really young, I really do believe in setting up an environment that is supposedly childproof, meaning that they're not going to get hurt, and allowing them to touch and feel and, put their mouth all over whatever they can. For me, was basically the kitchen and the hearth, the living room. And the kitchen, they had, all the cupboards that they could open, they would open and the pans would come out. And I even put spoons and stuff down where they could bang around. But if you notice, once they get it all out, they're not even contented with it until you put it back orderly again. And then they're suddenly interested in it again, right? But it's just allowing them to get to know their environment that way. But then as time goes on, they're more capable, for instance, of, like my oldest son, who was very bright and brilliant, he learned how to put um, the drawers so that it would be a stairway up onto the counter where he could get into the top, the tippy top, where there were things that, were out of a child's reach, but he was a bit of a monkey. You have those monkeys who can crawl, and then, you either have to move them and put them under lock and key, or you basically say, if you do that again, then you won't be allowed to play with it for a while until you can listen. That's something that you have to ask mama to play with him. With him, it was things like vinegar and baking soda. And then he was an alchemist. So cinnamon and basil or whatever, but he had to ask for permission. So that is a very good way to help children to learn about permission. This is mama's cooking shelf. You ask mama for permission. And then, of course, I would get it down and let him shake a while, but I wouldn't let him empty the whole cinnamon thing out type thing. And that is developing a really good sense of boundary. This is mama's room, this is mama's drawer. If you want to look at mama's drawer, you ask mama. And, they're getting older as they can do that sort of thing, and they can start to understand and that the whole world isn't theirs. They identify with everything in the world when they're born. It's just how they are, that everything is them. And so over time, they have to learn that everything isn't them and everything isn't theirs. So it's a gradual process. but I do think it's important to help children to learn to respect other people's property. So, when you go to other families' homes, you don't just go open all the drawers and so, if you've got a really young child, that might mean that you have to bounce them on the hip, or you say, can we go outside, or can we close that door because that is a dangerous place for them, or whatever. Ways to help enforce those boundaries. Um, how do you stop the pushing of boundaries before they start pushing the boundaries? Well, they push the boundaries when you're not clear about them or you're inconsistent. When you're consistent and they know you mean what you say and you enforce what you say, and it usually isn't that hard. For instance, children fighting over things, I just say, if we fight over that, we're going to put it up until you can learn how to take turns and share. And you put it on the shelf, and then pretty soon they want to play with it, and suddenly they have learned how to take turns and share. Not a really young child, but a 3 or 4-year-old can do that. So you have to learn how to enforce natural causes. In other words, they hit someone, and so then with me, okay, we don't hit and move them on. But if they keep hitting, well, then they stay at my side. They stay with me. When you're hitting, you have to stay right here because we don't hit our friends. That's not friendly. We do friendly things for our friends. So I draw a line and show them what friendly is. Friendly is saying, please, may I? Can I help you? Would you like a turn? Here, you can have it now. That sort of thing. What about whining and tantrums? Well, always you have to look at the causes of things like that. Generally, whining and tantrums have to do with, are they tired, or are they hungry, or is there some nutritional component that they're missing? And often whininess has to do with a shortage of iron or a shortage of calcium or magnesium. And so you look at ways to bring that in either through supplements or, there's liquid supplements, which I think are easier with children, or food sources. And then that they get to bed at a regular time and that they get plenty of sleep. They're not going to be pleasant if they're not well rested because their sense of life is disturbed. Their sense of well-being says, I don't feel well, and I'm just going to act like I don't feel well. And the tantrums, that's a more complex thing to talk about. Yeah, and it's more individual. So, I would want to talk to someone more about their child specifically and find out it's their nervous system. And once again, it mostly always happens when they're tired and hungry. Yeah. Um, and, when they're in a tantrum, you basically have to not let them hurt themselves or anyone else. And you can't really deal with the issue until the tantrum is done. And I remember reading, just ignore them and let them lay there and throw their fit and they won't do it again. I had 2 tantrum throwers in my family. That never worked. And so, I let them finish their tantrum. And then later that evening, I would work with it on what the issue was. And really the issues are more constitutional. And that's a very, very big subject. So, punishing, beating, and shaming is a common way to discipline to hold boundaries. What is your suggestion how to not do that? As I said, I don't believe in it at all. I don't think children should be hit. I mean, there's the rare occasion, one of my children, we lived by a very deep, like a 6-foot deep and a 12-foot wide canal. And when we first moved there, he loved to go up there, and I would take him up there, and then I'd say, you can't go up there without asking me, without me being with you. So he did. I gave him 1 warning. I gave him 2 warnings. I said, if you do it again, then I'm going to have to spank you. And I did. And he never did it again. So it's not that I don't think you shouldn't ever spank. I think it should be a very rare almost never event. And, basically, I just feel children need to be redirected, that they need to be with you at your side, doing what you're doing, helping, being active, put to work. On a farm, it's easy. There's always food to harvest, food to, all that sort of stuff. So, um, and shaming's it's a big topic. It isn't easy to just say a lot about it because I studied shaming a lot. I when I was younger was part of Al-Anon, which is the group that works with people who are married to alcoholics, which I was. And there are some wonderful books and study of shaming. Shaming is way more involved than you think it is. And I think mostly the way to avoid it is to be affirming. So you're not pointing out to them what they did wrong, but really moving on to how they can do the right thing, not to hit. But here, we can ask them to play with us over here in the sand rather than hitting them or that sort of thing. And it's an involved subject. To understand shaming is a pretty deep topic. So I would suggest, I think it's a worthwhile thing for everyone to study because we unconsciously shame each other. And shaming really is belittling, and it doesn't help you to incarnate in a very healthy way. So I think shaming should be avoided with children as much as you can. So that was a lot of questions, and I think we're done for the night. So we went over what are boundaries, how are they created, and why it's important. The main reason it's important is that they have a sense that you are a divine spiritual being who has brought your higher ego in a very firm way, that it's easy to see who you are, what you believe, what you want, what values you hold. And that's what you're trying to model for them so that their higher being can come in and be able to function in a very complex, especially now, and chaotic world. So, yeah. And we will close with that beautiful verse. May my soul bloom in love for all existence by Rudolf Steiner. So there we are. Thank you.